today. I'm really thrilled to introduce our second distinguished speaker. This speaker is Professor Jim Bushnell from the University of California at Davis. We are thrilled to welcome him here for several reasons. First of all, of course, because of his remarkable career track over the years. He has been the director of an energy institute at University of California in Berkeley, which has been a landmark place for producing very topical research on the restructuring of the market at a time where California was experiencing a crisis. So we were watching and looking and reading seriously what we were producing then. And for several also reasons, because it's one of these few bizarre economists who were initially trained as an operation researcher. So you managed to mute completely from an OR guy to an economist and a pure economist, being now associated with the National Bureau of Economic Research. So over the course of the year, you have accumulated a wealth of experience in the modeling of electricity market. We are thrilled to have you here. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, Olivier and Steve, for the opportunity here. So my first task after that wonderful introduction is to apologize and lower expectations again. This talk is going to be a lot more of me complaining about sort of how the world consumes models from people like us, and maybe a little bit about us producing those models. It's something I've ruminated on. I'm sure many of you have sort of thought about these things as well, and trying to do something about it is much more difficult. How to deal with uncertainty, especially in these circumstances. So my colleague Aaron Smith, who's an econometrician at Davis, he and I have been collaborating on sort of different approaches to try to incorporate things that the macroeconomists have been playing with over the years into our world of more energy climate modeling as well, but it's still very preliminary. So both the time series model and my optimization model are going to seem a little simplistic relative to some of the things that have been presented over the last day. So feedback is appreciated. All right, so I'm used to presenting this to economics audiences, and so this is going to be a little bit of a different, you guys know this stuff basically. I'll take a step back and just say, empirical economics, the tools that are usually employed there are very good for studying the world as it is or just was. So there's a lot of kind of looking for natural experiments or even performing experiments on real market settings, real people, and then running regressions, doing identification to try to measure treatment effects of different policies and things. But when you try to study climate, oftentimes the questions are deep in the future, and the types of papers that my colleagues and I have written on climate policies tend to sort of look at short-run effects. So papers on how electric vehicles, the emissions created by electric vehicles, for example, or what the effect of renewable energy is on different climate emissions, they tend to look at variation in the wind or in some other natural weather setting, and they measure the marginal impacts of emissions or whatever else you're interested in. So those are kind of marginal measurements. They can be measured very precisely, and economists think a lot about the right way and whether those results are believable, but they are by definition sort of marginal tests. And when we think about climate change, it's all about non-marginal change and dramatically different ones, and of things that we don't quite yet know what will happen. And so there's this problem with trying to do forward-looking stuff that often means we have to do models. So we do these a lot of times, and not to single out anybody, but I and others have done these energy optimization planning models, expansion models, and so forth, that are often some type of quadratic or various types of optimization programs. Usually they're top-down. The goal is to either minimize costs or maximize social welfare. So it's sort of a leader, a great leader of the economy who's sort of building out the energy system to meet some usually climate goal. And they usually have very catchy nicknames like Pathways or Switch or Gen X or Empire was a new one I learned today. My favorite is Dr. Dre. It's a distributed resource Resources model out of MIT. And then there's just, the National Energy Modeling System, NEMS, which is kind of boring, but it's the big one in the United States, run by the Energy Information Administration. These are usually, I'll call them partial equilibrium models. They tend to measure how the markets within maybe the electricity industry or electricity, oil, gas interact with each other, but they're not, what economists would consider a general equilibrium model would have the entire infusion of the tax base back into different types of labor markets and so forth. And usually we don't go to those types of breadth in order to sort of try to do more precise modeling of the narrow energy sector. They're often very dense with detail. So you can, because we're doing an optimization model, if you can find a constraint or if you can find some data, or even make up some data to put in, you can get it out of the model. And so, at least in the US, you can make great output of these sorts of models because you get all sorts of, you can produce as much output as you want. This is like catnip to policymakers and journalists, especially when they want to know, how do we get to net zero by 2045 or 20 whatever? You can sort of say, well, here's exactly how we do it. We'll do this much of wind and this much of solar and so forth. And you can give a very sort of detailed picture coming out of models like this. But the cost of this, and I say here, it's seductively rich in detail because people will consume this, and this is going to be all about, there should be error bars here, but we don't really have a good way of creating error bars. And so this is our attempt to try to think about how to add something to that. Because these models are heavily dependent upon assumptions in very sometimes opaque and complicated ways. Many of you in the room have probably had to referee other people's models in papers, and it's a very painful thing to do because unless you're running the model yourself, you don't really know exactly all the details and all the nuts and bolts. You can look at pictures like the bar graph and try to sniff out inconsistencies, but unless you're inside the model, it's very hard to sort of judge it. And then you get, oftentimes there are pictures like this. This is Rhodium Group, a consulting firm in the US that's often quoted in the newspapers on climate policy. And you see sort of, okay, here's a projection, and this is an example of how I think this is how the investment, the IRA would reduce emissions. They're looking at some policy, and basically you often will see a middle line, and then a low line, and a high line. We've all made pictures like this. And you stare at this and you think, confidence interval, but it's not. There isn't usually a statistical basis for any of these things. We just sort of run a scenario, and oftentimes it's sort of a joint set of inputs that we would put through a model, and one that gives us the high emissions would go on the top line, and one that gives us the low would go on the low line. All right, but there's a lot of uncertainty behind these things, and this is one example that is kind of unfair, but this is from the Energy Information Administration. This is going back to the 1980. The lines that are going sort of up through the ceiling here are their forecasts at different dates. The one at the very height there is a vintage 1981 forecast coming out of the EIA of what natural gas prices would be like the next few years. So as of 1981, this is what they think prices will be in 82, 83, and 84. And then you get to 1983, the forecast is a little lower, but still going straight up. The bottom line there is the actual trajectory of prices. And so EIA was consistently sort of, especially at the moment of deregulation of gas in the industry, sort of projecting gas prices would just continue to skyrocket for many years into the future, and in fact they sort of went the other way. So we can't, what we know for sure is that some of the parameters we're plugging into these models are going to be wrong. We don't know how wrong. How do we sort of try to better convey that uncertainty? My wife is fond of reminding me that life is not an optimization model. This is sort of, when we model an industry as if a single entity is making all the decisions for all the actors in the industry, how far from reality are we going to be? That's actually an issue I'm not going to address here, but I do think what we probably could do more of in this field is some backwards sort of recreation of trying to take actual input values and see how well the models actually recreate what happened. If we took 2010 and took what we thought the values of different market values would be as of 2010 and ran an investment model for the next 10 years, what would it look like? And it's often a painful but good learning exercise. All right, so that's the me shaking at clouds part. There's frustrations of how to interpret these types of models. They're heavily dependent upon assumptions, but we got to say something about the future, and running a regression just on past data won't necessarily do everything we want. All right, so what can we do? I think the starting point here, Derek made a comment about how decision science thinks about this, and this is where I think a lot of times we project out, or policymakers want to see mean values for things, when in fact it may not be minimax, but there are things that are not, we don't want to optimize for the mean value of something. The way I think about it is if we were trying to do a model of the altitude of our airplane as we're approaching a mountain, we're less concerned about the mean trajectory of our airplane and more concerned about what the minimum sort of altitude of the possible trajectories might be. And therefore, we might be willing, or we probably should be willing, to sacrifice accuracy in terms of the bias of the mean, in terms of a better picture for what the range or distribution of the possible outcomes should be. So what we're doing here is trying to draw from the experience that macro, which doesn't have the best reputation for doing forecasting either, I recognize here, but they've gone through a similar sort of journey of starting with very detailed oriented, trying to model how different actors in the economy behave, to kind of more of a reduced form, more simplistic kind of forecasting approach that's much more just data-driven, time series driven. And so the general approach we're going to do here is we're going to split the difference. We're going to run some time series models to try to forecast some of the key variables that we think influence the outcomes of an electricity expansion model. And the example I'm going to do here is going to be of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And we can come up with at least a statistically rigorous, or at least a statistically there's a justification to the ranges there. We feed those ranges of inputs into a more traditional optimization model, and what comes out has some basis. We can try to develop some error bars around that by looking at what the range of uncertainty of the key inputs going in would be. Now the limitation is, there's other things that we're not capturing in terms of uncertainty, but we're trying to quantify the uncertainty of sort of the key inputs here, and hope to add to the list of variables that are going to be going through this exercise. And by going through that exercise, you can also identify what sort of the key sensitivities in models like this might be. What I'm going to show you is sort of what happens to renewable investment as the gas price goes from a very low to a very high level. There's lots of other dimensions in which there's sort of a dramatic change in the outcomes of models based upon what the input assumptions might look like. All right, so this is a slide Aaron sent me, so I can't speak for it firsthand, but it's a very brief macroeconomic history, and I'm going to only show you 2 dots from it. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of, I think, similar kind of approaches as what we do in a lot of energy optimization models, where there's a lot of assumption-laden models. They were more econometric, many variables, a lot of detail. And what happened since that was a move towards vector autoregressions, that the idea is to use historic patterns of relationships between sort of a key and rather small set of variables to try to develop a picture of the likely trajectory of those values going forward. And as Aaron sort of describes it, it's let the data speak without imposing our sort of expectations on what we think should happen. So we tried to adopt this to several contexts. We there's a parallel paper that does this with carbon emissions forecasting using a relatively parsimonious model of 8 variables, basically. And the idea here is to try to both isolate the key relationships between variables, so joint distributions matter. If we think that certain outcomes are completely contingent upon or very sensitive to certain inputs, we want to know how likely it is that this joint realization of those inputs might be. And then the other kind of thing that really is, I've had trouble getting my head around, and certainly the policymakers I talk to have trouble with, is that simple models with less variables are actually perform better at the out-of-sample part of trying to sort of paint a picture at least about what those variables will be doing in the future. When we do this for, say, emissions in California, a lot of time we'll send out, here's a forecast of what emissions under the cap and trade program would look like, and we often get questions like, well, how much gasoline is going to be used in Southern California? And that's not in the model. What we have is sort of a variable for total gasoline consumption or something. The levels of details are intentionally limited in order to give a better capture better the range of future trajectories. Okay, and so what we're doing this with, and I think this basic approach could be applied to a lot of different modeling settings. Integrated assessment models, if they could be run quickly enough, is another sort of idea where if you have distributions of the key inputs driving the things that these models are sensitive to, you can run them through those models and then get some statistical basis for the ranges of outputs coming out of them as well. Here I'm doing a traditional kind of dispatch investment model of electricity, because I've already made one, written a couple papers using it, and it's a question that I've been curious about myself. All right, so to give you just a brief kind of policy description, if you usually do this in the US, so everybody had been like sick of hearing about the Inflation Reduction Act. This is the last of the big bills that the Biden administration was able to pass. It does lots of things, climate and well, there's lots of things, let's say. The part that I'm focusing on in this model here is the IRA extended a production tax credit, which is a direct dollar per megawatt hour subsidy to the production of certain types of zero carbon electricity. Traditionally it had been just wind. It has at times been solar as well. The IRA brings in nuclear power as well for certain levels of subsidies. And then there are other elements as well, including an investment tax credit, which gives a tax rebate for capital investment on other types of technologies, including storage, which we want to get in our model, but we don't have in the model yet. The levels of subsidies is somewhat unfortunately complicated because it's linked to various conditions. If you hire union workers, you qualify for $26 a megawatt hour. If you build your power plant in an economically stressed area under sort of the desire to have more economic development, you can earn an even higher subsidy there. We're using the $26 value, which from what I understand talking to folks is sort of the most likely set of criterions to be met. There's also a domestic content requirement and a bunch of other things. It's when it passed, there was a lot of excitement and hype about this. It was described as the most significant climate bill the U.S. has ever done. There's a lot of talk about how we hadn't done anything towards the Paris agreements, and now we're finally, going to do something. Largest ever investment in climate. Paul Krugman had a really understated take on this. So there was a lot of kind of studies put out by both the official legislative analyst office and other outside organizations that tried to both peg the cost of this bill and the effects of the bill on climate outcomes and other sorts of policy goals. I'm giving you the official quotes here, which is about $380 billion is what the whole bill was supposed to cost, and the direct subsidies to electricity generation and storage were about $120 billion, were sort of some of the numbers that were kicked around. But importantly here, the only thing that's actually in the law is the $26, $34 sort of range. How much money gets spent depends upon just how much energy gets generated, how much investment. So there isn't any kind of formal limit to the cost of the bill. All right, and there were New York Times, to give an example of the type of picture I've been complaining about, showed sort of, okay, under current policies we would have the red line, and now that we've passed the IRA, it's going to take us down to the green line. At least they didn't give something that looks like error bars here, but it is a remarkably kind of precise sort of forecast. And these sorts of things were bandied about quite a bit at the time it was passed. All right, so that's the context that we wanted to try to apply an attempt to put some error bars around projections like that picture I just showed you. What we're doing here is updating an electricity dispatch investment model that's been used in a couple papers. The most recent one was one studying the U.S. Clean Power Plan, which you may not have heard of because we didn't ever actually pass it. It was an Obama-era climate policy that got really close, but was reversed by the Trump administration. What this model does, you folks in the room many of you would be familiar with it. We basically do a dispatch of all of the at least fossil generation in the western United States. What's maybe a little different is that this has been we're sort of iteratively calibrating it to the actual market data for the calendar year 2019. We have more work to do on that though. But from these various sources, we have hourly output of all the different renewable sources, all the hydro sources, and so forth. And we're trying to dispatch, and we have fuel prices, electricity market prices, and so forth. And we try to run a dispatch model that looks like it's pretty close to replicating what the world looked like in 2019. And then we add to that an investment aspect. So we project out some demand growth, project out some other things that I'll show you in a minute, and then we solve for a least cost entry of, we're limiting choice to 4 different technologies here, a couple gas technologies, wind and solar for the moment. Like I said, we're working on adding batteries. I won't show you equations here. I'm used to presenting this to economists, and they hate it when you show them optimization model equations. You guys love it, so. But I didn't have that slide. We're assuming basically that if the PTC is passed, which it was, the wind and solar will get $26 per megawatt hour. So what we're going to do is solve this model and see what kind of future investment happens under different resolutions of future uncertainty in a world without the $26 production tax credit, and then solve it again with the $26 production tax credit in place. Basically, the marginal cost of zero carbon electricity becomes negative $26, which makes you want to build a lot more of it. And then we measure off, I'll show you different outcomes looking at the differences between those two, the world with and without the PTC. There's just some other notes here. I've said several times we're going to add storage. There is also payments to nuclear that are not part of our cost estimates. We're assuming the nuclear power plants don't retire, at least in the time horizon that we're modeling, and therefore we're taking their output as of 2019. We're assuming they're going to continue to behave as they did in 2019. And basically with the other types of existing zero carbon resources as well, the hydro, the renewables, we're assuming that's going to continue as they did in 2019, and then we're going to add some more of those resources on top of the existing ones. So this is, the renewables are aggregated up to regions. I'll show you regions in a second. This is all sort of limited by the degrees to which we can find hourly data. Hourly data is reported now at a balancing area sort of level in the United States. Think of it as sort of a slightly sub-state level. We've aggregated a little bit. These are just the hourly profiles of generation from hour 0 through 24 here for our 4 different sub-regions. What you see is a whole lot of renewable energy in California in the upper right-hand panel there. That is the existing solar and a pair of wind output in as of 2019. There's decent amount of wind in the Northwest and in Arizona as well. It just looks small relative to California's output. What I'm assuming here now is if you build another megawatt of solar in California, it's going to follow the load profile of the existing solar in California. And what that does, what it's already done, is it makes actually investing in solar in California not very attractive because there's already so much of it. Prices are quite low during those periods in which solar output is quite high. So if you're doing an economic-based investment decision, solar actually looks not very attractive absent these subsidies that we're going to be talking about. So in each of these, we have from the Energy Information Administration an overnight cost of capital estimate for the different technologies in each of these 4 parts of the country. If you built a renewable resource, you're basically, I'm assuming that renewable resource would have an output capacity factor, an hourly load shape that's analogous to the existing resources in that same sub-region. So if you build wind in New Mexico, it's going to look just like the average wind plant in New Mexico, for example. And as far as the equilibrium condition here, the dispatch model is just sort of, okay, we actually have a slightly downward sloping demand. There's a very subtle slope to it. And we're just maximizing social welfare, which is really close to minimizing cost given it's a pretty inelastic demand curve in terms of at least the quantities here. And essentially we know what the actual price was and the actual quantity. That's sort of this intersection point here. I drew the optimistic sort of circumstance where, yeah, we get pretty close. Our simulated price ends up being pretty close to what the actual price was. We observed the actual observed demand. We also observed the quantity of renewables and the quantity of hydro being produced in that region in that hour. We just subtract that from the demand. So what's left is the amount of demand that needs to be met by the dispatchable fossil resources for which we've assembled marginal cost production estimates for. So we have our estimate of the supply curve of the merit order for these power plants in this different part of the region, and they're satisfying the demand that's left over after the actual renewable and hydro output. So no, we're not redispatching the hydro. If someone wants to complain about that, you have a good point. Now, the investment, that would be just if we're trying to recreate the actual hourly results that we were basing the data on in 2019. Once we start doing investment, the idea is, all right, new renewables are going to push this entire supply curve over. So now that fossil supply curve is pushed further to the right. The existing renewables and hydro are still operating as they were, and this new renewables has basically pushed this curve over so that we're meeting the same demand now out here at a lower price. So the effect of entry has lowered the price in this hour, and basically the equilibrium entry condition is going to be, we have a cost of entry, and it's going to be, okay, we keep on building new capacity, which depresses the price, until the point where the revenue that is earned by this new resource, if we add up all the hours in which it's generating, exactly equals its cost of entry, which has been annualized. I've taken the sort of overnight cost of capital and turned it into an annual cost. We're basically simulating a year. You can think of it as taking that year and thinking of that as the long run equilibrium, or repeating that year 20 times over, whatever your investment horizon might be. Okay, so that's the equilibrium investment. If we had a PTC, it's the same thing. It's just that we would build even more renewables and it would drive the price even lower because they're earning the additional $26 per megawatt hour subsidy. There's a little bit of transmission in this model. It's aggregated up to these 4 big subregions. It's a DC load flow model based upon the capabilities of the major interties between these regions. The stylistic kind of reality of life in the Western U.S. Electricity market is that there is, everybody wants to ship power from here to here, and actually increasingly the folks down here want power as well, and there's a higher voltage, better interties along this route, but traditionally, people have wanted to ship power this way, but because it's electricity, it wants to go that way as well. and this is usually where the binding constraints are, because this is generally a lower voltage part of the network. Still, more of it's going to want to go this way, but there's definitely some limits on what's often referred to as the donut, where power will go around the circle, where sometimes they'll want to just send it straight down. So we're trying to capture kind of the main sort of qualitative constraints of locational generation congestion in the U.S. We're not building new transmission, though, in case you're curious. Okay, so that's the part that you guys are familiar with, and you know, I'm sure there are models that have that do this in a more advanced way, but the main point is to find something that solves relatively quickly so we can solve it a lot based upon distributions that we're going to draw of input variables that we think are kind of interesting. So this is ongoing work with Aaron Smith. There's a couple papers that I've written with Severin Borenstein and Frank Wallach on cap and trade markets in California, where we're doing similar things. We're using a vector autoregression to forecast kind of the key uncertainties. In this particular case, we're starting with 4 variables that we think are going to be kind of the key. Well, there's a GDP variable that's going to be linked to this. There's a natural gas price. There's the real interest rate, and then there's basically the electricity consumption, or the overall electricity demand. It's a single variable for now, so as sort of aggregate electricity demand grows, we're just assuming all the regional demand and all the hourly demand grows proportionately. So a 10% growth rate in electricity is going to grow electricity 10%. We're thinking about trying to model that more as a peak and an energy variable separately, and also add some maybe regional resolution to this forecast as well. Basically, this is a vector autoregression. We're thinking about the co-integration. And the way I think about these things is basically you're looking at the historical relationship between the variables you're going into this. You're regressing the variables on each other and the historical values of those variables for a certain number of lags, and then seeing how changes in one variable sort of propagates through and affects or is correlated with changes in the other variables. And then by estimating those parameters, you can project out those relationships into the future and develop joint distributions of these things. So the key things I'm going to focus on here are two variables that really affect the economics of building particularly renewable energy, which is the natural gas price and the interest rates, which affect the capital-intensive nature of renewable energy much more than, say, a combustion turbine. Okay, so this is, we're doing basically 1,000 draws of future potential realizations of all 4 of those variables. This is the projection of natural gas prices in the US out through 2035. What I'm doing here is I'm doing kind of a near-term scope of what we think the IRA might do, and taking a slice of 2028 here, so it's kind of the range in this part. And each dot represents one possible realization of future gas prices. Here is real interest rates. Again, there's sort of some worlds where real interest rates go back down to what we've been enjoying for the last 10 years, and others where it looks like the 1970s. And the key thing that I did not realize before starting this exercise is, at least coming out of this, our projections of natural gas prices and real interest rates are pretty highly correlated. So in our future realizations where we have high natural gas prices, we also have high real interest rates. And that's going to matter because the big downside of a policy like the IRA, which just pays you to generate renewable electricity, is a lot of times it's really costly because you would have built that renewable energy anyways. And therefore the cost per megawatt created, or the cost per ton of carbon reduced, rises really fast because a lot of the new energy is non-additional. When does that tend to happen? Well, it tends to happen when gas prices are high, for example. So this is, I'm going to do some cross-sectional slices here. The histogram in gray represents the range, truncated a little bit, but the range of future gas prices that the model is investing with, taking as an input into the investment. The red line represents the amount of wind that's being built with the PTC, the production tax credit, the $26 per megawatt hour subsidy. The green represents what investment patterns would look like without this investment subsidy. So let's starting with the green line here. This is wind starts being built when gas is around $5 per MCF. I think this might all seem really cheap to you guys these days. So around $5 per MCF, the wind starts getting built, but below that, the investment technology of choice is combined cycle natural gas still. But then once you get out beyond, say, $5, $50, $6, nobody wants to build gas and you want to build wind and solar anyways. The PTC gives you a little bit more because you're willing to tolerate prices that are at least $26 lower, so you get more entry. But the additional extra entry sort of levels off rather quickly when you get to this end of the distribution. I think the mean out of all this, it's a very left-skewed distribution here, or is it right from your perspective? So the mean is about $7, but there's a lot of mass. The median is down, I think, around 5. All right, so you can think of the impact of the IRA then as being the gap between the green line here and the red line. So when gas prices are low, the IRA is having a big effect. It's discouraging gas investment and encouraging renewable investment that would not have happened. When we're over here, the IRA isn't doing much. And as a result, costs shoot up really fast. So actually, it turns out forecasting costs of this policy is not that difficult because people are going to build a certain amount of renewables no matter what, at least in this dimension. It gets more complicated in the next dimension. But it's the actual impact of the policy on climate that's different. So if I look at the same kind of distribution in terms of what the model's spitting out in terms of resulting annual emissions from the Western grid, without the PTC at low gas prices, emissions rise pretty rapidly around, what actually happens here is you see a little bit of a rise here because people, as gas prices go from say $2 up to $5, there's a little bit of coal to gas displacement, or gas to coal, I guess. And then after gas prices get even higher, then you start getting the wind entering, and that's displacing both coal and gas. With the PTC, emissions are just lower. And so again, the effect of the production tax credit is basically the gap between these things. It's most significant when we have gas prices on the low end of the range. The black line here represents the median of this one variable's distribution. This is the cost of carbon reductions per ton. So basically, we take that 2 slides ago, combine it with the slide before, we can come up with the amount of dollars per ton that implied reductions of carbon are giving us from this policy. They start out quite effectively when the PTC is doing a lot, and then they rise to over $300, or around $300 a ton in the range where the PTC is spending a lot of money because there's a lot of wind, and it's not actually giving us much extra wind because it would have been built anyways. All right, now the story becomes different when we think about interest rates, though. Basically, everything gets reversed. So now this is the histogram of the just interest rates, again, holding gas at $5.14, which is around the median value of gas. So at that level, this is the distribution of real interest rates that could happen. It turns out when real interest rates are really low, capital-intensive investment looks a lot better than when interest rates are quite high. The PTC, again, is the difference between the two lines. It has the biggest effect when interest rates are kind of high, but not insanely high. And then when they get really high, you're not building even with the PTC, or you're not building that much. And so as a result, the cost of the PTC starts out that it goes down rapidly. The costs are highest when interest rates are low because there's a lot of investment. And at least down here, the costs are low. You're not actually getting much renewables, but you're not spending much money either because you're not getting much renewables. Annual emissions look like this, where emissions are quite low when we have really low interest rates, and then they rise very rapidly when actually gas is pretty low, and this would be high interest rates as well. So again, the PTC is measured, its effect is measured off the gap between these two lines. This is the cost per ton just in the dimension of interest rates. And the key here is it's not just one of these dimensions or the others, because what matters is the joint distribution of all of these things that might influence these outcomes. So back to the slide I showed a little while ago, these things are jointly pretty correlated. And so what happens is the PTC is more impactful when interest rates are low, but it's also most costly when interest rates are low. But at least that means when we're spending a lot of money, we're actually getting a lot of carbon reductions from it. And when you combine all this uncertainty, you end up with actually a smoother distribution than I expected, which is that the median is around 78, the mean is around $115 per ton. There's a big tail again, but in a sense, the correlation between the interest rates and the gas price turns out to really matter in terms of creating, reducing some of the downside of this policy. All right, so just to wrap this up, this is one example, remember I tried to lower expectations, of trying to capture the effect of uncertainty in the types of models that we're used to doing. It's a qualitative point we're trying to make right now rather than a quantitative one. We're going to try to improve both the forecasting model and the investment model. But the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that a model like this, or an exercise like this, could be used to highlight the importance of the policy instrument itself. The PTC is what economists call a price mechanism, in the sense that it pays a fixed price for every kilowatt hour, every megawatt hour of zero carbon energy produced, and doesn't have any quantity limits on it. And we know that that gives you a lot of dollar risk, because that can give you a lot of non-additional energy, but it maybe gives you more certainty on the quantity of both carbon emissions and renewable energy you might get. Other mechanisms like a carbon cap probably give us a different sort of implication in terms of its interaction with the uncertainty. What we want to do next is add, clean the data and the inputs. We're going to add some stuff, and really trying to think about, we picked 3 things that we think are really kind of central to the economics of investing, what goes into these models, what sort of gives us more or less renewable energy. We're trying to think of other things that we could add in there to, again, try to quantify the uncertainty. Obviously, the cost of technologies that haven't been invented yet, that's a big thing. But we don't have historical time trends in order to kind of develop a rigorous estimate of what that looks like. So this exercise is kind of trying to limit to the known unknowns of the variables that are still important, but that we can try to quantify the magnitudes of uncertainties from. Maybe battery materials, I'm not sure if the time series is long enough on that, other materials like steel, and things like interconnection times, which is a big uncertainty in terms of development costs in the United States. And that would be one element of transmission. So these are the types of things we're thinking about. I'd be happy to hear your ideas and thoughts, both now or at the happy hour and over the rest of the course of this conference. Thank you. It's a bit hypocritical because I wrote all these papers about market power and electricity markets, and now I don't do that anymore. So, and I justify it largely, at least in the U.S. setting, as there is a lot of evidence coming out of market monitors and the FERC that market power it's not California 2000. It's a relatively isolated phenomena. So I'm less worried about the market power. I'm a little more worried about just sort of the universal cost minimization kind of, that there are other kind of organizational barriers there. So it's a valid point. I'm not sure what to do with it, other than one could sort of run these models again, and this is where this is another sort of strain in my research. You run a model like this, you compare it to the actual realized outcomes, and then you can try to interpret what the differences are. They might be market power, they might be other sort of frictions in the market, and maybe there's a way to just sort of quantify those deviations. There are folks who are looking at how, sort of as a small digression, our early sort of simulations were very crude. We didn't really have unit commitment constraints and other sorts of things, and that was actually pretty good for up through 2010. The early version of this Clean Power Plan paper used data from 2010. We could recreate the West as it was with a pretty simple dispatch model. It does terrible in 2019 because there's all these renewables in the West now, and so it turns out that the ramp rates, the other constraints, are really important in recreating what the world looks like in 2019. And there are some folks I know, Akshaya Jha and Gordon Leslie are doing work on Australia, where they're kind of doing these types of models, but trying to sort of look at which thing is missing that really gives us something that's very different than what we're observing. So the best I can offer is sort of backcasting, I think, is an important exercise. It's not one that I'm doing here other than sort of for the calibration. I'm not sure the best way to try to add error bars to that, though. Anyways, I could rationalize it as basically saying the US market is, I think, reasonably competitive, especially if we're talking about the longer time horizons here. And so that's less of a structural concern for me than something like this. Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't go out to 2035, because the investment choices we're making are all essentially based upon technologies that are mature or reasonably in place today. Even lithium-ion batteries are becoming pretty widespread in California, and so when we get out to 2035, 2040, next generation solar or some other things, that could really matter, but I don't have, if you have any good ideas on how we sort of represent that uncertainty, what we may end up doing is just sort of Monte Carlo draws, but then we're kind of making up the distribution, and that's kind of going back to sort of, well, we're trying to have some more rigor to those error bars. And yeah, so it's not gonna satisfy those people who want to see the world in 2050 in a sense, but also I think that's the reason we're trying to limit our ambition, because we're trying to limit it to the known unknowns, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I should have been repeating the questions for the video, but yes. So the question is, how would this extend to Europe, or what would this look like in Europe? And I think the answer is, there's the two elements. I assume cheap gas would favor gas even in Europe, although there's national policies that might still forbid that. But the relationship between the gas market in Europe is so dramatically different than that in the United States. And I mean, I don't know, you guys are building so much LNG capacity, maybe they will become more linked soon. But yeah, I suspect if we ran the same VAR for a European gas index and other European cost indexes, we would get a very different relationship because those markets are so different. But I haven't thought of doing that yet. So yeah, we were surprised by that as well. It's easy to sort of, again, it's kind of the let the data speak philosophy. It's what the VAR is telling us. We can kind of tell stories that sort of, oh yeah, that may be why it's doing it, but ultimately it's kind of the data are telling us that is the relationship. If you look at sort of the raw data, there wasn't a lot of tight correlation between interest rates and natural gas prices in the 1980s, but since the shale boom, basically, they've been moving pretty tightly with each other. Sure. Hmm. Yeah, we do have those results. I don't know if I have the slide with me, but yeah, what's interesting is, so the picture I showed you was of the cost. The actual quantity of reductions is a very bimodal distribution, where you can think of it as almost two separate distributions, one centered around a low amount of reductions and one centered around a high amount. But the way it turns out is what the interest rate effect has done is it's made the high quantity reduction realizations be the same realizations that are also high expenditure of the PTC. And so that has made it sort of simplify this graph, where the graph of actual reductions is much messier than this one, though. So you can think of it as, to first order, there's one set of realizations where we don't get much out of the PTC, but it's also not costing much. And then we have another where we get a lot out of the PTC, but it's costing a lot. And those things kind of both balance out to be in the $100 per ton range. But yeah, just thinking out loud, then if we had a cap that maybe where the costs would skyrocket if we don't meet that goal, then that might give a very different picture here, for example. Yeah. They give reverse effects on, yeah, exactly. So, high gas prices are great for wind, high interest rates bad for wind. And so they offset each other, not perfectly, but to some extent. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, mhm. Yeah, and I should say the subsidy for existing nuclear is a bit complicated, but I think it's around $15 to $20 per megawatt hour, which is less than the other renewables, but a lot more than what they were getting before, which was zero. And so I do think it is enough to keep most existing plants that aren't really close to their lifetime, and most of them can get extensions. I do think it's enough to keep almost all of them around. The amount that they earn is linked to energy prices. So if energy prices actually rise very high, the amount they get out of the PTC shrinks. Just nuclear, so it's interesting, they could have done that for all of the resources, but that's only for the existing nuclear. But that again is sort of, I think, sufficient to keep the existing around. New builds, I guess I'll believe it when I see it. There's one facility, Vocal, that's been under construction for, I think now 15 years, and suffering massive cost overruns. But it was a conventional reactor with an old design that was initiated during the height of high natural gas prices, and they have a lot of regret to having started it. And that experience, where it's been a very negative experience building a new nuclear plant, the only one that's been under construction in the U.S., I think has sort of soured the mood for that. There is constantly talk about small modular reactors, and maybe we'll see that. But sort of back to the earlier question, I don't think we'll see it anytime soon. And there's an interesting kind of other concern about policies that focus on sort of getting to zero carbon by a certain very early date. Is there are certain technologies that aren't mature now that that will be crowded out if we basically spend a lot on existing technologies in an effort to get to zero by a certain very early target. That may not leave much room for the next generation of technologies, at least until the current generation of renewables that we're building now retires. And so we don't have it in the model because I just don't know. I don't know what to believe.